Welcome back, everybody. We're going to talk about spice factor today and how that applies to our recipe and what is that, right? So, and you remember our couscous recipe, we had a spice factor of 3.1%. Well, what is that? Where did it come from? What does it mean? Why do I need to know this, right? Well, and basically it just makes things easier for us to calculate, because what we can do is we can use it to adjust recipes cost for ingredients like spices and herbs and seasonings that make up a very small fraction of the total cost of our recipe. Generally, there could be 8, 9, 10 of them, and they'll only add up to 2 or 3 cents, depending on the recipe you're doing, right? So to do that calculation for each individual spice or herb, dried herb, it takes a lot of time. So we've got a sort of an average way to make it a little bit quicker and a little bit easier, right? So the few things to know is that every restaurant is going to decide what ingredients are included in their spice factor, right? So if you want deep fryer oil in your spice factor because you don't want to be worrying about measuring out how much oil was used in the recipe to make fried chicken, you can include deep fryer oil in your spice factor along with salt and pepper and onion powder and cayenne pepper and all those dried spices that we use. It's going to save you time when you're calculating a recipe, like I mentioned, right? What you decide to go into your spice factor in your operation cannot change from day to day. You have to decide, okay, these are the things that are going to be in my spice factor for my restaurant, and that's the way it's going to stay, right? You can't go, oh, well, salt was in this month and it's not in next month. No, you've got to keep it consistent, because basically what you're doing is you're spreading out the cost of your salt, your pepper, all those spices across every recipe in your restaurant, whether one recipe uses more salt than another, right? You're sort of you're averaging your spice costs out across all your menu items, right? And it allows for things like seasoning to taste, right? Salt and pepper to taste, right? Well, how much is that? What's the cost of that? And it's generally a minor amount. It's an important amount because you do spend a lot of money over the course of a month or 2 months on spices, but you may not buy salt more than once every 3 months, right? You buy a 20-kilo bag and you may not buy salt next month, right? So it allows you to apply a set percentage to all your recipes to make it consistent across the board, right? So, like I said, it divides the cost of spices and seasoning across all dishes rather than making one really heavy in spices and you having to calculate all the cost of those spices, right? I leave this in here. I don't like it. It can be used to account for garnishes and reject dishes returned from the customer. Garnishes, yes, no problem. You want to sprinkle some chopped parsley on a plate or something like that. That can be included in your spice factor. But rejected dishes or errors, you want to be tracking those separately, and we'll talk about those later on in the course. But it is mentioned in your textbook, so I like to talk about it here. Can be applied to either the recipe's total cost or the cost per portion. Because we're going to use a percentage, in the case of our couscous it was like 3.1%, we can apply that to the small portion cost, or we can apply it to the whole recipe before we divide it by the portion cost. Because it's a percentage, it will act differently on a larger number. You'll get a different value on a larger number than you do on a smaller number, right? So once you've decided what ingredients you're going to keep in your spice factor in your restaurant, how do you determine what that percentage is? And just a note, when you're talking about spices, you may want to consider not including things like saffron, which is a hugely expensive spice that could throw the cost of a dish off by a couple of dollars, depending on how much you're using in it, right? So mostly your generic spices, things like that, right? So determining your spice factor, you're going to, first of all, obviously decide which items are going to be included, like we said. You're going to decide if you want to include that reject value of dishes, and then you're going to take what you spent on those spice factor items over a good period of time and divide that by the amount of food you purchased over that whole time, including what you spent on spices. So for instance, if you spent $1,000 over 3 months and on your spice factor items, and you spent $10,000 on total food cost for the 3 months, you're going to take your spice factor amount of $3,000 out of your $10,000, right? And that's going to give you a percentage that you can then apply to all your recipes. So I've got an example. So a restaurant purchases $120,000 in food over 3 months. The spice factor items over that period are valued at $2,600. What is the restaurant's spice factor? Well, the question has already told us what we spent on food, right? Let's use the blue. We spent $120,000 of our food purchases. Out of that $120,000, we spent $2,600 on spice factor. This is food cost, right? So that's, we divide that out, we're going to get 0.0216 or 2.16%, right? You could round that to 2.2%. That's the percentage we're going to use in our restaurant, because we decided what these $2,600 worth of spice factor items were in our restaurant. And we took this over 3 months. We don't take it over a week, because how many times do you buy a bottle of cayenne pepper? Probably not every week, right? So you're going to take a good chunk of time, like 3 months, and figure out how much you spent on spice factor items to figure out what your percentage is. Okay. Once we've got that percentage, how do we apply this to our actual recipe or our portion cost? Well, we're going to figure it out by taking our recipe cost and multiplying times 1 plus our spice factor in a decimal form. In other words, we're going to add 100% to our percentage we calculated. In the last example, we had 2.2%. So we could go 102.2% and multiply that times our recipe cost to get our total cost. And I'll show you an example coming up here, right? We use the equation on all recipes regarding the spice or herb used, and if the dish contains multiple components, we adjust each recipe for spice factor, right? So multiple components talking about a plate. You've got your roast beef, mashed potatoes, and glazed carrots. You're going to apply your spice factor to each one of those components before you add your portion costs together, okay? All right, so next example. Our recipe's total cost is $27.72. If the spice factor is 2.2%, and what is our spice factor adjusted cost for the recipe? So what did we do? We took 1 plus 0.22, or 0.22, sorry. That's looking messy. Let's write that again. 0.022, because we changed our percentage into a decimal, which is going to give us 1.022. And we're going to multiply that times the cost for our recipe of $27.72 to give us a total cost of our recipe of $28.33. Now, if that recipe was 10 portions, we could divide by 10 and we get our portion cost, right? Let's say it was 10 portions. Let's divide by 10. We're going to get $2.83 per portion, right? What if we divided by 10 before, right? So what if we figured out our portion cost first and went $27.72 divided by 10 gave us a portion cost of $2.77. If we multiply that times our 1.022 that we got up here, my pen works, right? We're going to end up with, guess what? Same price. See what I mean by it doesn't matter if you apply it to the whole recipe or just the portion cost. Now, if this +1 sort of confuses you, you can simply take this 27.72 multiply times our 0.022 to get the cost of our spice factor, 27.72 times 0.022, which is 0.61 cents. And then we can simply add that back into our 27.72, and we're going to end up with 28.33, right? All we did is this +1 just skips this step of adding it back to our original total. Okay, so that's spice factor, and that just makes your life a little bit simpler when it comes to costing out recipes, and you don't have to cost out every individual spice, and you're like costing out spice per gram, and it's 0.0004959. Like, you can apply this percentage to all your recipes. And yes, you're going to lose a little bit on the cost of one recipe, but you're going to gain a little bit more on the other one. But really, your spices in your recipe really don't add up to much more than 2 or 3% of your total recipe cost, which is what your spice factor is. So it's weighing what your time is worth to spend costing out each one of those individual spices separately versus how you could do it like this. Okay? The next video, we're going to talk about Q factor and how that applies to making your life simpler when you're costing recipes.